Law number 2. So you've decided you're going to develop a credential. You've gone through and you've documented all of your market research and you're ready to go forward. So this is something I always recommend very much before you begin. You want to get stakeholder agreement before you begin so you don't have what I call the moving target. So many years ago, I was brought into Long Island, New York. We flew probably about 20 subject matter experts in from all over the world for a technology company. I had just gotten involved. They had been developing a credentialing program for something called RFID technology at the time. And we met with the CEO, and they at the time had developed it to be vendor specific toward their particular software. And he suddenly decided that he wanted it to be an industry-based certification and wanted it to be vendor neutral. So if you can imagine those next 3 days, we basically threw out everything they did and started over. So these are the types of key decisions that you want to make sure your stakeholders agree on before you begin. By stakeholder, I mean anybody that can influence the direction of the program down the road that would make you have to change directions. So you want to get these key things decided up front before you start. So some of the things I always recommend: make sure you're clear about the purpose of the exam. Make sure that you're clear about the target audience for the exam. Keep in mind that a lot of times when you develop an exam, you're going to have a kind of a primary job role, which is the one you're really targeting. And then you might have some secondary job roles that these people can take it, but they're not really our target market, so to speak. Make sure you're clear when you're doing the development. Here's your target market. These are the guys we want to focus on for your development. Also, the other thing is sometimes there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace because job roles can vary quite a bit from company to company, as I'm sure you're aware of. So one of the things I always recommend is listing out some of the major responsibilities of the job role. This is also going to help your marketing team immensely if you give this to them, because one of the worst things that can happen is you launch a program, somebody in a job role comes and takes it, and then it ends up that their job role is very different from the job role that they thought was being tested. And so because job roles do vary quite a bit from organization to organization, especially between smaller and larger organizations, I always recommend putting some clarity around that. Another thing that's really important is your description of minimally qualified candidate. I don't know how many of you use this. It's typically used during the standard setting process. In our development methodology, we use it at the very beginning of the test development process. This is basically the conceptual definition of the person who is your person that's just minimally qualified, or the person who's just going to barely earn the credential. It sets your standard of performance, basically your level of difficulty for your exam. And it's kind of like a persona that you would use in marketing. So a lot of times when we talk about this person, we do it in terms of the level of education or training, the existing knowledge that they might have or existing training. So we might say this person has gone through certain college types of courses. They've got 1 year on the job experience. We might talk about number of hours or years on the job experience. It's pretty common, especially healthcare. They might say they have 250 hours of supervised, this sort of a thing. Sometimes in software or even in surgeries, because it's tough because you're like, well, you could have a 1 year person, but they maybe only done implantation or surgery once. Sometimes in those areas, they'll say the number of implementations or the number of surgeries, whatever makes sense. Everybody, it's a little bit different. You have to think these through. But what this does is tries to help your subject matter experts level set on who is this person that we are setting as our standard of performance, and what is that level of difficulty that's appropriate for them. So also which job activities can and cannot be performed with or without assistance or adult supervision, so to speak. So these are some of the key things that we include in that description. The reason that description is important is because this sets your level of difficulty for your exam. So again, I've had a number of experiences where we've said, okay, we are going to create this exam for somebody with 1 year of on-the-job experience. So when you start the development process, you're saying, okay, which types of activities do they do on this job for 1 year? What types of knowledge and skills do they need to know at 1 year, right? So then if a stakeholder later comes in and says, well, I really think this should be for a 5-year person and not a 1 year person, and you've started development, typically you get to go back and restart the whole development process again. So anything that impacts that level of difficulty for your exam, especially when it comes to things like level of experience, be very careful that's very clear at the very beginning of the process. Because again, an exam that's developed for somebody, say, with 1 year of experience or an entry-level exam is very different from somebody with 10 years of experience. Other potentially important parameters, like I mentioned before, if it's vendor neutral, vendor specific, if it's US or international, that's also going to have implications. If it's international and you're dealing, there's often differences in scope of practice when you deal with healthcare. Also, there are different regulatory issues. So if one of the main things of your credentialing program is making sure people comply with OSHA regulations, and then you decide you want to go to international, you might want to think that through a little bit. So I can't give you an exhaustive list of what parameters you'd think about, but these are just some of the things that over the years have been kind of gotchas, so to speak. So just things to really kind of think through. And like I said, do this at the very beginning before you start development. Because if you don't think this through at the very beginning and you start development, a lot of these changes and these types of decisions will mean that you're going to have to go back and do a substantial amount of rework later on, and a lot of cost involved with that. Also, if you're seeking accreditation, ANSI and NCCA are obviously the most popular ones in our profession. I can't tell you how many calls, and they seem to come in strings for some reason. Maybe a couple months ago, I probably had like 2 calls a week of people saying, my boss just said we want to get, ANSI or NCCA accredited. And I said, well, great. Have you done this, this, and this? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, you at least got another year of development, and then you probably have another whatever time. So you're probably looking about 1.5 to 2 years out. So you need to make sure you understand what's involved. That also is going to impact your structure as far as how you set things up, because these organizations, for a very good reason, want to make sure there's a firewall between your training and your certification or credentialing organization. So just make sure you understand what's involved with it. And then also when you're doing your big design work at the very beginning, is making sure you're clear of what's in scope and what's out of scope. Sometimes what you're not measuring on an exam is just as important as what you are measuring on an exam. So it's also really good to be clear about that. And the other thing to really think about is continuing education and recertification requirements at the beginning. The reason this is important is because once you have your first test taker, that clock starts ticking, right? All of a sudden it's like, all right, so what am I going to need to do for recertification or continuing education? So again, as you're designing your program, think through what is it going to require to have them keep their credential current, and then what's your process you're going to use to track it, because you're going to need to communicate that out to them clearly, and you're going to need to figure out what that process is. Test maintenance updates. This is also a very interesting area, especially for anybody like in the IT software industry. So for most programs, you're going to want to do what I call a health check at least every year, if not more, depending on the volume of the program, just to make sure the test is performing the way you expect it to perform. You're also going to need to do content updates, and this is a particular challenge within the IT software industry. Because they have so many releases that come out, their content is constantly going out of date. And so it's a real challenge, especially for your bigger IT software providers. It used to be that they would try to go on release cycles, every 3 or 4 months, depending when the releases were out and if it was a major release. And now a lot of them are doing what we call continuous deployment, where they're just always pumping out releases. So it's a challenge for the industry as a whole, but it's just something, again, think about how you're going to deal with these things, because it's all going to impact your budget and your costs and your timeline. And then also you're going to want to refresh the content just to enhance test security. If you've got the same content over and over and over again, people are going to memorize it. You can't stop people. You could have the best proctoring technology in the world. You could have people standing over somebody's shoulder and they're still going to be able to memorize it. You can't stop that. Also, I always recommend when you go through something, we have something called a test definition document that we use to document all these decisions. It's a great little template that we use. I always recommend when you're going through and you're making these decisions, even if certain stakeholders can't be there, document it. Document it and send it out. I like to do what I kind of say, the speak now or forever hold your peace, as well as that'll work, to make sure everybody's on the same page with those big design decisions. You also use it to make sure that your subject matter experts are aligned on what your minimally qualified candidate is. And also, it's also important for informing marketing activities. Some of the big things you run into with the marketing activities is making sure that they're very clear on what the purpose of the exam is, what the intended interpretation of the scores are, how the exam is supposed to be used. You want to make sure when they market the exam that they're very clear about that. Because if an organization goes and uses it for some other purpose and does something they shouldn't do with it, you want to make sure that that doesn't come back on you, that you're very clear about how it should and should not be used. And then that puts the onus on whatever organization that might be.